So, January 27th is, if you were not aware, International Holocaust Remembrance Day. This date was selected to coincide with the liberation of Auschwitz in 1945. And in honor of the occasion, I thought I might undertake to read a little bit of fitting literature, that being the Night trilogy by Elie Wiesel. Now, you may be familiar with the name Elie Wiesel. He was himself a survivor of the Holocaust, a humanitarian, I believe, and also he won the Nobel Peace Prize. In this book, the Night Trilogy is really an omnibus which collects three books, those being Night, which is his memoir of his time during the Holocaust, as well as two short novels, really novellas actually, entitled Dawn and Day, which, while fictitious, are nonetheless still semi autobiographical. And these works are, while not linked narratively, are definitely linked thematically, giving a view onto the life of a Holocaust survivor during, immediately after, and sometime after. So I read them all, and now I'm here to review them. So join me, won't you, as I review the Night trilogy by Elie Wiesel. So starting out with Night, this is the big one, the one that really made Elie Wiesel's name. It is considered one of the hardest hitting and most impactful and most renowned works of Holocaust literature, and it is his memoir of his time during the Holocaust. And it is brief, too. It is a blistering, barely like 100 or so pages. It moves fast, it covers a lot of ground, and it does not mince words. Now, an interesting fact about Night is that what we get now with what is contained within this book, this omnibus here, is not what the work originally was. So whenever he initially, I think, undertook to write about his experiences during the Holocaust, what he produced was a nearly 900-page manuscript entitled "And the World Remained Silent," I believe. And that was originally written in Yiddish, but eventually he tried to get his work published in French, I believe, and subsequently there was a lot of editing and a lot of cutting, and that giant work got whittled down to a slim 100 or so pages. So there was a lot that got cut from the original version to what we have now with Night. But anyway, so the plot of Night, not very complicated. It starts out young Elie Wiesel is an adolescent in his village of Siget, I believe it's pronounced, in Transylvania. The Nazis come, they get rounded up like cattle, and they get sent to concentration camps, Auschwitz, actually, I think. And his mother and his sisters are separated from he and his father, and we don't really know exactly what became of them. I think they died, or at least most of them died, I think. And then the rest of the book is just Elie and his father surviving the brutal conditions in the concentration camps. It's absolutely deplorable, inhumane. Does not even begin to describe it. So I'm not going to try to just go through everything that happens, because you can probably imagine, they're worked like slaves, and when they can no longer work, they're just summarily killed. They really are just no better than human cattle in these conditions. It's just downright monstrous. But eventually, they have to get moved to Buchenwald, and there Wiesel's father succumbs and dies. But then the camp is liberated not too long thereafter, and then it just ends rather abruptly, really, with the young Wiesel looking at himself in the mirror and remarking how deathly he looks. So that's pretty much the plot of Night. So let's talk about the technical aspects of it. So the writing in this is not the flashiest. It's not really the most ornate that you'll ever see. It's on the plainer side. It's pretty direct. However, it suits the story well, and I think that the more direct approach kind of serves to make the events which it portrays appear all that much more stark. So the writing, it's not overly adorned, but it gets the job done, and it serves the story, like I said. So I don't really have a complaint with the writing. Now the characters, well, we really only have Elie Wiesel himself, and because obviously it's narrated by him, and beyond him we don't get much. But he is the character who we see. Obviously, we see it through his eyes, so we get a glimpse into his psyche. And we see him change over the course of the book. And what the real meat of the book is, it's not just the brutally inhumane physical conditions that he has to endure, it's what this does to his spirit. So at the book's onset, Elie Wiesel is a very, very devout young man. He prays a lot. He is very, very passionate about Kabbalah. Very, 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 very devout. And as the book goes on, we see that just get stripped away. Because if you did not know, there is something called Holocaust theology. And that arose because after the Holocaust, people, the majority of them, I guess, Jewish, had to reckon with the fact that how could a God, which they believed in, and which, supposedly chose them above all other races to be a nation of priests, how could that God allow what happened to them to happen? How could that be allowed? Because it was just beyond. I mean, there had been genocide in the world before, but nothing quite like that. Nothing quite so industrialized and so on such a large scale and efficient manner. It was, truly something the world had not seen. And so after it, a lot of people had to kind of reevaluate their own theological views in light of this indefensible atrocity. And we see that reflected in Wiesel's character in the book, because again, like I said, he starts out so pious, so devout, so wanting to be a servant of God, and then by the end, he's pretty much just over it. He's like, I'm not bowing, I'm not praying, I'm not doing anything else because you just can't see that and still think that that God is good. Basically, is the gist, and it's very very powerful, and it's very very kind of it's pretty depressing as we see his youthful fervor just be beaten out of him into just kind of a hard and bitter and very cynical young man by the end. It's definitely a very powerful work, and that's why this book is so highly renowned because of just how powerful it is. The characters where it counts are definitely gets the job done. But now let's talk about the pacing. My biggest complaint with this work is that it really could have been longer, actually. So, like I said, the original version called "And the World Remains Silent," I think that's what it was titled, was almost 900 pages, and that got whittled down to a slim 100 or so. So there was a lot that was left on the cutting room floor, and I think perhaps a bit too much. So it covers a lot of ground, and it covers it very, very quickly. And while we do get certain reflections and ruminations on Wiesel's part as he's witnessing himself change and remarking upon the changes that are happening in himself due to these just brutal conditions, there's not a lot given to much else, and that really kind of shows up in the character of his father, who is not really much of a character at all. Now, I really thought that he could have done maybe a little bit more with his dad's character, because it becomes like an inverted parent-child relationship by the end, as his dad is just not really able to support himself much anymore, and so Wiesel is having to care for his own father kind of like a child. But yet, we never really get that much insight into his father's persona. He's kind of opaque a little bit. And I think he could have done a little bit more to flesh out his dad to let us see the kind of man that he really was. I mean, he tells us certain things, but he doesn't really show us much except his father just kind of dwindling away until eventually dying. It's powerful, but I do think there could have been more done. And also, I think this moves perhaps just a teensy bit too fast. It covers so much in such a short span that that's really my one complaint is just that it's a little bit too short, I thought. So overall, to rate Night, I'm gonna give that one an A minus. It's immensely powerful. It's very impactful emotionally, but it could have been a little bit longer, I think. And again, that's just my real criticism. But what it wants to convey to you, it gets across, and it does so with great power. So yeah, to rate Night A minus. So that brings us on to Dawn, which is the next volume of this omnibus, and which is actually a novel. Well, it calls itself a novel, but really it's like a novella because it's only like 80 pages. And this is fiction, but as I said, it's still at least semi-autobiographical fiction. And Dawn concerns Elisha. It's not Elie Wiesel. It's like an alternate version of him named Elisha, who is fighting in what is referred to in the book as the movement, but which I think is really the Irgun, which was a Jewish terrorist organization which fought a long time ago to wrest control of Palestine from the British, which were occupying it at that time. So this concerns a Holocaust survivor, much like Wiesel himself. Again, this is kind of just a thinly veiled alternate version of Wiesel, who is now, it's like it just takes place just a few years after the Holocaust, so in the immediate aftermath, and they were trying to fight to secure Palestine from the British. And they're not, the morality here is very, very gray because they're willing to do some very um, questionable things to achieve their goals. And I mean, they are terrorists. But the whole book of Dawn is concerned with this character Elisha, and it's told again in first person, having to wrestle with himself about having to execute a British soldier when the dawn comes. It takes place over one night, and the movement has captured this British soldier and they're going to execute him at dawn in retaliation for the execution of one of their men by the British. And so the whole thing is an intensely psychological exploration of this character coming to grips with what they're going to do. And I said this is semi autobiographical, and it is because Elie Wiesel actually, I think, attempted to join the Irgun and almost became a terrorist freedom fighter, but he didn't. But this book is still, even though it's fictitious, it's kind of him, I think, speculating on like what his life might have been like had he actually successfully done that. But I have to say, I think Dawn actually was my favorite of the three works here contained because it really was suited to the blisteringly fast page count. It's only like 80 pages or so, but it really was suited to that because again, it takes place over a very short amount of time, and it's so deeply psychological that it takes place almost entirely just in one character's head. In the ending, you might see it coming. You might, I mean, it's pretty clear where it's going from the first, but it gets a lot of miles out of its premise, and we get to witness this character both wrestle with what he's going to do in his immediate future, as well as review his past and just the unimaginably cruel treatment that he has received from the Nazis and stuff. And it's kind of it's very, very complex psychologically, and like I said, the morality of it is very, very gray. Um, but I have to say, I think Dawn was my favorite actually. So the writing of it was not terribly different from Night, although I think maybe it was trying to be maybe a teensy bit more poetic at times, but not too terribly far removed from the previous book. But it's good enough. It's fine. The characters in this I found Pretty interesting. I mean, essentially, it's another first-person narrative, which we're seeing this entirely from one character's eyes, and his head is just kind of in constant turmoil, wrestling with himself back and forth. Um, but it makes for a good protagonist. So characters, I liked it, and the story, like I said, it's much more suited to the really, really short duration. So overall, I think Dawn was actually my favorite of these works. So I think I'll give Dawn uh, an A, a little bit above Night, just a teensy bit. So yeah, Dawn, I'll give it an A. Now that brings us to Day, which is the final book in this omnibus, and which concerns once again Elie Wiesel himself, although a kind of a fictionalized version of himself, as he is living in New York in what I think it's like the 1950s, so like 10 or so years after Holocaust. And he gets hit by a taxi and nearly killed, and so he is hospitalized. And the whole story is just him in the hospital recuperating and reviewing his past and reminiscing and kind of again just reviewing his life and what has happened to him and how it's made him into the person he is. And this is also semi-autobiographical because Elie Wiesel himself was hit by a taxi, I think, and nearly killed. But everything else is fictitious, I think. But anyway, so the character, which is again Wiesel, a fictionalized Wiesel himself in this, is just reviewing his life, his survival of the Holocaust, and he's living with what it's basically PTSD and also survivor's guilt. And there's lots of conversations about the weight of the dead that the living drag around because he survived when so many others, including his family, didn't. And he's really dragging around some baggage, and he's kind of just all torn up inside. But this one is also very psychological. But I have to say, I think Day was my least favorite of these three works. Very, very slow, not particularly as gripping or visceral as the previous two works because everything, all the Holocaust stuff is in the past and it's just him kind of recollecting it. So there's not really that immediacy there that there was in Night, or I guess in a slightly lesser sense in Dawn. But in Day, it's just one man reviewing his life and convalescing. And there's some good stuff in here. There really is. And again, it has a lot to say about the trauma of the past and how to move forward, or if you even can move forward. Good stuff, but it just didn't really hook me like the other two. So the writing in that one is basically kind of just the same. I think by the time you get to Day, you're pretty much familiar with Wiesel's style of writing. Although that one, Day does, I think that one really does try to be a teensy bit more um, poetic, have a little bit more flair to it. Although some of the lines I thought were kind of questionable, just a little bit. So the writing, it's about the same. It's fine. The characters, likewise, this is yet another first person and intensely psychological narrative. It got the job done. It did, and the story is much slower moving than the previous two. Not much really happens, but it says some valuable stuff. It's just that this one kind of dragged a little bit and it wasn't quite so interesting to me. So to rate Day, I'll give Day a B. Still good. It's fine. Just I think this one was the weakest of the three. But anyway, that has been my review of the Night trilogy, or Night, Dawn, and Day by Elie Wiesel. Have you read any or all of these books? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about them, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said here today. I think Night is actually used in schools to teach about the Holocaust and stuff, so you may have encountered it there. Um, but if you haven't read these books, I could recommend them mostly. Night, definitely, because that one, although you do have to kind of take, you do have kind of have to approach it maybe as not a memoir in the strictest sense, because since its publication, there has been so much debate around: is it 100% true? How much of it is true? Did he embellish some things or kind of spice it up in any way? because there's quite a bit of dialogue in it. And again, I think usually with memoirs you don't get that much dialogue. It reads, even though it is a memoir, nominally at least, it reads very novelistically. But still, even if just a fraction of it is true, it's worth a read because it's an eye opening read, or certainly can be. And then Dawn, again, I think that one may be my favorite. Not as well known, but still very impactful. And then Day, not my favorite, but still a good book. So yeah, I could more or less recommend these books. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.